Revolutionary like I'm Huey Newton. Che Guevara when them bullets start shooting.
Hello comrades, and welcome to another episode of Communism for Beginners. And this time we are looking at Foundations of Leninism chapter 4, the Dictatorship of the Proletariat. And this was a slightly longer chapter, and there's an absolute ton of stuff to cover, so I'm gonna try my best to do this as quickly as possible, try to not go on for too long. So let's get right to it. Stalin takes three main topics to discuss again. A. The dictatorship of the proletariat as the instrument of the proletarian revolution. B. The dictatorship of the proletariat as the rule of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie. And C. Soviet power as the state form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now those are all very important subjects. So he quotes Lenin. He says, quote, "The fundamental question of every revolution is the question of power." Lenin. Does this mean that all that is required is to assume power to seize it? No, it does not. The seizure of power is only the beginning. For many reasons, the bourgeoisie that is overthrown in one country remains for a long time stronger than the proletariat which has overthrown it. Therefore, the whole point is to retain power, to consolidate it, to make it invincible. What is needed to attain this? To attain this, it is necessary to carry out at least three main tasks that confront the dictatorship of the proletariat on the morrow of victory. A. To break the resistance of the landlords and capitalists who have been overthrown and expropriated by the revolution, to liquidate every attempt on their part to restore the power of capital. B. To organize construction in such way as to rally all the working people around the proletariat, and to carry on this work along the lines of preparing for the elimination, the abolition of classes. C. To arm the revolution, to organize the army of the revolution for the struggle against foreign enemies, for the struggle against imperialism. Yeah, so, first of all, the fundamental question is the question of power. That is really key. If you don't take power, and if you don't succeed in holding power, then everything is lost, basically. Anarchists often complain about various methods that the Bolsheviks or other communist revolutionaries use. And it's really interesting, actually, because anarchists, like the old school anarchists like Bakunin, Kropotkin, they were not opposed to violence in any way. But these modern anarchists, who basically, I think they're anarchists only because right-wing propaganda has convinced them to be scared of communism. So they complain like, oh, Bolsheviks were so violent, why do you need to use all this violence, why do you need to use all these repressive measures against the exploiter, landlord, kulak, rapists, why can't you just let them, do what they want to do, why can't you just let fascists advocate for killing Jews, why can't you just let landlords do what they want to do, why can't you just let all these horrible people do what they want to do, why do you have to be so violent? Because of course it's always the fault of the, at least according to right-wing propaganda, it's always the fault of the slave who rises against his master. But anyway, so doesn't really, like, my argument against that has always been that it doesn't really matter how good intentions you have, if your methods are perfectly democratic, perfectly peaceful and pacifist and perfect in all ways, but if you still don't actually manage to stay in power, then it's all for nothing. It's basically worthless. That's my main criticism of this anarchist critique, because, for example, in Spain, in the Spanish Civil War, the anarchists complained that the Soviets tried to force the anarchists into a coordinated army hierarchical structure, and the anarchists opposed the idea, and they went anti-Stalinist. They said, oh, we don't support that because we're anti-Stalinist. Like, when there's fascists who are like coming at you with tanks, that's not like the best possible time to go anti-Stalinist. I mean, that's like maybe you should make an exception and just unite with the anti-fascists for once. So the practical reality is that you need to have power. Otherwise, the fascists are just gonna take over, and it's gonna be absolutely fucking horrible. I mean, nothing is worse than a failed revolution, because it's gonna be an absolute massacre when the capitalists take power again, because they're gonna kill everyone who they think was responsible for the revolution. They're gonna try to make sure it never happens again, basically. And there was a failed revolution in Finland, which is where I'm from, and it was pretty bad. I mean, the white terror was absolutely horrible. There was like a massacre, first of all, and then death camps, and women, children even being slaughtered. Lots of people dying of disease and hunger, but predominantly from just being executed, even if they were civilians and women and children. And then 2 decades of fascism after that. Not exactly fascism, but like semi-fascism was what I would call it. We didn't exactly have a dictator, but there was no political freedom. But anyway, I'm going off topic. So they need to break the resistance of the landlords and capitalists and liquidate every attempt on their part to restore the power of capital. Now, Venezuela is actually it's an interesting thing to look at in this in relation to this subject, because so far Venezuela has managed to liquidate all the attempts of the capitalists to take power, but it says here in this chapter at some point that it goes through all the advantages that the capitalists have even after the revolution. So I think that helps in understanding what the situation in Venezuela is at the moment, because the capitalists still manage to cause a lot of problems there. Then it says organize construction in such a way to rally all the workers around the proletariat and arm the revolution. So arming the people and starting to create a revolutionary army, that's also very important, because you have to be able to defend yourself. But he continues, the dictatorship of the proletariat is needed to fulfill these tasks. And then it quotes Lenin, the transition from capitalism to communism, says Lenin, represents an entire historical epoch. Until this epoch has terminated, the exploiters inevitably cherish the hope of restoration, and this hope is converted into attempts at restoration. And after their first serious defeat, the overthrown exploiters, who had not exploited their overthrow, who never believed it possible, never considered the thought of it, throw themselves with energy grown tenfold, with furious passion and hatred grown 100-fold into the battle for recovery of the paradise of which they have been deprived, on behalf of their families, who had been leading such a sweet and easy life, whom now the common herd is condemning to ruin and destitution or to common labor. In the train of the capitalist exploiters follow the broad masses of the petty bourgeoisie, with regard to whom decades of historical experience of all countries testify that they vacillate and hesitate, and one day marching behind the proletariat and the next day taking fright at the difficulties of the revolution, that they become panic-stricken at the first defeat or semi-defeat of the workers, grow nervous, rush about, snivel, and run from one camp into the other. So there's a couple of important points there. Mainly the point about the petty bourgeoisie, that historical experience has definitely shown that they because they're small owners, like the well-to-do petty bourgeois, they're more capitalists, and the really poor petty bourgeois are semi-proletarian. So of course it's not like an entirely homogeneous group of people, but they definitely I don't remember what it was. I was just reading something yesterday. Was it I think it was either the Left Narodniks by Lenin, or it was a Left Narodniks whitewashed the bourgeoisie. I don't remember which one it was, but anyway, Lenin basically says that the petty bourgeois has two souls. It has a proletarian and an owner or capitalist soul, because they are small owners, but they also work. That is extremely important to take into account. And also this, where he says that they take fright at the difficulties of the revolution and become panic-stricken, and then they switch sides. And it also says that one day they march behind the proletariat. So it's important to realize that when the revolution is doing well, all kinds of people are gonna join it. But they're not necessarily good communists or good socialists just because they follow you when you're doing well. It's the real test is what they do when things go bad. I mean, just look at like Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, what they did in various circumstances, and Trotsky, what they did in various circumstances. When things were going well, they were all supportive of Lenin, but when things went bad, they all betrayed him in some way. Zinoviev and Kamenev betrayed Lenin on October, and Trotsky and Bukharin betrayed Lenin in 1918 with about the Brest peace, and on various other occasions. But those were some of the crises that happened, and you know. And this is also kind of the anarchist mentality that when there's the first sign of problems, when there's problems in the actual practical reality of the revolution, when it's not just all utopian, then they start to whine and complain, and then they change sides, go to the side of reaction, because the revolution wasn't perfect, socialism wasn't perfect, therefore let's side with something else. Okay, then he talks about the advantages that the capitalist class has. He says, firstly, in the strength of international capital, in the strength and durability of the international connections of the bourgeoisie. And I believe that is a Lenin quote. That's Stalin quotes from Lenin. So first of all, the bourgeois in the country where the revolution has happened, they have connections to bourgeois abroad. I mean, look at Venezuela, and you can easily understand what's going on. And also, even more so, the bourgeois, like the world outside the country, is entirely bourgeois. So there's still capitalists inside the country who have connections to other capitalists abroad, but the entire outside world is capitalists, at least mostly. So that is a big risk. So he continues, secondly, in the fact that, quote, for a long time after the revolution, the exploiters inevitably retain a number of great practical advantages. They still have money. It is impossible to abolish money all at once. Some movable property, often fairly considerable. They still have various connections, habits of organization and management, knowledge of all the secrets, customs, methods, means and possibilities of management, superior education, close connections with the higher technical personnel who live and think like the bourgeoisie, incomparably greater experience in the art of war, this is very important, and so on and so forth. Fairly self-explanatory. They've got money, and although the anarchists sometimes argue against it, you can't abolish money all at once, and or even very quickly. I mean, it depends on the circumstances, of course, but particularly in a country like the Soviet Union, which was so economically poor and culturally and economically backward before socialism happened, it wasn't something that they could do very, very quickly. Of course, if socialism was going to happen in some Western country, then you would be able to make progress faster, because there would be less problems and so forth. But I don't think that's very likely. But I think it's probably going to happen in the poorer countries. And he also says that higher technical personnel and other people like that live and think like the bourgeoisie. So that could be considered the labor aristocracy, or just higher technical personnel who have a lot of privilege, who even think like the capitalists do. So that is important to realize, that even though some people might be technically be workers or people who get a salary, but they're still not necessarily trustworthy. He continues, thirdly, in the force of habit, in the strength of the small production, for unfortunately small production is still very, very widespread in the world, and small production engenders capitalism and the bourgeoisie continuously, daily, hourly, spontaneously, and on a mass scale. For the abolition of classes means not only driving out the capitalists and landlords, that we accomplished with comparative ease, it also means the abolition of small commodity producers, and they cannot be driven out or crushed. We must live in harmony with them. They can and must be remolded and re-educated only by very prolonged, slow, cautious organizational work. That is actually a Lenin quote as well. He quotes a lot of Lenin, but that's kind of why Stalin is good. He is good at explaining Lenin very concisely, and yeah. So small production engenders capitalism. So all this talk about, especially what anarchists, not all of them, but Proudhon, and particularly those really old school anarchists and utopians of various kinds, they want, and I guess in a way even modern anarchists, because they are, even though modern anarchists aren't really in support of small production per se, they are still opposed to centralism. So small production engenders capitalism, and that is why Stalin thought that the main internal danger to which would cause capitalist restoration was the peasantry, because they were a majority of the country, and they were all basically small owners, even though many of them were very poor. But some of them weren't, of course. But he thought that the kulaks were the real danger, but not the kulaks themselves, because they were like 10% of the population or something. But he figured that the middle peasant, who was a substantial chunk of the population, that the middle peasants might be, because they're petty bourgeois, they vacillate, they might change sides. So the kulaks might be able to convince the middle peasant to join with them against the Soviet government. So that was one of the reasons for the collectivization of agriculture, although it wasn't like planned like that. It just kind of happened. It started as a spontaneous movement together with some of the government's policies, like the grain procurement policies against the kulaks and stuff like that. But basically the idea was to isolate the kulaks, to crush the kulaks, basically rely on the poor peasantry who was on the side of the revolution, and then try to convince the middle peasants to side with the poor peasants. But anyway, so yeah, small production is a problem. Although luckily, the more capitalist a country is, the less of small production there is, because capitalism tends to centralize everything. So there is more and more workers and fewer and fewer owners. In another part, he says, Marx said to the workers, quote, "You will have to go through 15, 20, 50 years of civil wars and international conflicts," Marx said to the workers, "not only to change the existing conditions, but also to change yourselves and to make yourselves capable of wielding political power." So, again, that is important to realize, that it probably is going to take a while before socialism is victorious, especially like in terms of the entire globe. 15, 20 or 50 years is what Marx says. That was his guess. Of course, depending on the circumstances and whatnot, who knows, it might be very rapid if socialism actually happens in, let's say, India, Africa, and if China goes back to socialism or something, then, socialism might triumph really quickly. Nobody really knows, but it's impossible to predict. Then he talks about the actual dictatorship of the proletariat. He says, briefly, the dictatorship of the proletariat is the rule unrestricted by law and based on force of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie, a rule enjoyed by the sympathy and support of the laboring and exploited masses. And that is also a Lenin quote from The State and the Revolution. And then another one, the dictatorship of the proletariat cannot be complete democracy for all, for the rich as well as the poor. The dictatorship of the proletariat must be the state that is democratic in a new way for the proletarians and the non-propertied in general, and dictatorial in a new way against the bourgeoisie. So that is basically what the dictatorship of the proletariat means, what the term means. It's the dictatorship of the majority. It's actually democracy, but it's democratic for the workers and dictatorial for the bourgeois. So the bourgeois don't have any political rights, at least typically. That's what has happened. I mean, in the Soviet Union, generally it depends on the circumstances. The Soviet Union gave the kulaks and all the people who used to be white guardists in the Civil War, they actually gave all those people the right to vote in the 30s. But basically the important thing to realize is that it's supposed to be democratic for the workers. Now, when we talk about the actual historical experience of the Soviet Union, I think we can pretty much all agree that they didn't have full democracy. They had various kinds of restrictions on democracy depending on the situation, and that wasn't really because of any malicious intent. It was just the way things happened because of circumstances. And the Bolsheviks never said that there wouldn't be any restrictions on various kinds of freedoms. They were basically willing to do whatever it takes for the revolution to succeed. So in the Civil War, they banned pretty much all the opposing parties, because all the opposing parties teamed up with the whites, with the exception of the anarchists, but the anarchists were just anti-communists for other reasons. It wasn't because the Bolsheviks wanted to ban them, it was because the other parties basically made it impossible to not ban them anymore. In my opinion, there's two big events in Soviet democracy, or the development of Soviet democracy. One is the Civil War, which basically, it's war, it's martial law, so of course it's gonna mean a lot of restrictions on democracy. Banning of all the opposing parties, banning of their newspapers and their press, and all kinds of stuff like that. The control in the villages was given to the poor peasants' committees, and the control in the urban areas was given to the Soviets. And there were rural Soviets and village Soviets as well, but in the villages there were also poor peasant committees. And the other big turning point was the 1930s, when they actually tried to do democratic reform. The plan was to have contested elections, full equality of everybody had the right to vote, even if you were a woman, even if you were not ethnically Russian. So no matter what gender you are, no matter what race, you can still vote. And even the kulaks and the people who used to be on the side of the whites and the Tsar, even those people could vote. That was the plan, but because of fascism and various things that happened in the 30s, Kirov, who was one of the top leaders of the Communist Party, he was assassinated. They assumed that it was Trotsky was behind it. Maybe you think he was, maybe you think he wasn't. That's not really the topic, but they assumed that Trotsky was behind it, and that there was this conspiratorial organization of Trotskyists and Zinovievites who killed Kirov. And then there were various other things, like the kulaks who had been thrown into prison during the collectivization. They were all getting out of prison at this point. So there was a lot of talk of kulak rebellions. And then there was also the foreign invasions. The Spanish Civil War had just started a year earlier, and then the next year Japan invaded the Soviet Union, and Japan had already signed the anti-Comintern pact with Italy and Nazi Germany. So they were basically very afraid that there was going to be internal kulak rebellions and assassinations and sabotage in the industry, and especially like foreign invasions, which were basically already happening. Japan was already invading. So there was a lot of opposition to these democratic reforms, because it wasn't a good time to do democratic reform, basically, because it was a very dangerous time. So they ended up going through with all the reforms except with contested elections. And I think that's what pretty much killed the prospects of complete democracy, a complete proletarian democracy, in my opinion. Now, the real problem was, of course, that after the war they never tried to reform the system again, and I don't really blame Stalin for that, because it was his idea to reform the system in the first place, and it failed because the others didn't want to do it, and then he died, and then after that the revisionists never tried it. So I would blame the revisionists for never reforming the system, even though there was no real danger anymore. But that was a bit of an off-topic tangent, but I think that's important to realize. Then he talks about various things. He talks about Trotskyism and the full democracy and Britain. So Trotsky and these other people. Trotsky used to be cool, but then he kind of went super Menshevik and crazy. So his idea was that there should be like full democracy, and he's basically thought there should be like a reformist type situation, that the revolution wouldn't need to be violent, it could be peaceful. And he quotes Marx, because Marx said that in Britain, peaceful revolution might be possible because there was no major bureaucracy and no major military apparatus, and police was relatively weak and stuff like that. And Lenin pointed out I think it was in Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Trotsky, he pointed out that that's completely false in the Russian, or in the context of the 20th century. That even though in Marx's time that was possibly the case, there's no way that could happen anymore, because the situation had changed. And it was certainly not applicable to Russia, because in Russia it was basically complete police state tyranny. And then Lenin went against this Trotsky's idea of full democracy, which this idea that this is also an anarchist idea, by the way, that everybody should have the right to like the political freedoms. It basically says that there's no class character in this matter. Everybody should just have political freedom no matter what, which it's an anarchist position, but it's also a very very liberal notion. And just the other day I was talking with Red and Black Revolutionary in the comments, and he was telling me that the dictatorship of the proletariat doesn't really mean he literally said that it doesn't mean that one class, mainly the workers, has political supremacy. It means that all the revolutionaries have like power or something, which is completely false. It literally the dictatorship of the proletariat literally means that the workers have political control. That's literally what it means, and it implies that the capitalists don't. Now, the Bolsheviks actually argued for the dictatorship of the poor peasantry and the proletariat. So they wanted to acknowledge the role of the peasantry as well. But this idea of full democracy, that everybody, regardless of class, has political rights, it's completely bourgeois, it's completely counter-revolutionary and reactionary, it's complete nonsense. And it implies that in capitalism, that capitalism isn't the dictatorship of the capitalists, because although the proletarian dictatorship is a dictatorship, so is capitalism. It's just the opposite kind of dictatorship. In capitalism, the workers have no real control over anything. There's these sham elections where you can choose which capitalist you want to vote for, and even like if you had any chance of actually winning the elections, then they will just try to kill you in like inevitably. Just look at Venezuela. Like, it's a rare example when the revolution happens in the elections, basically, and the capitalists have tried to kill Chavez and now trying to overthrow the Maduro government. So it's complete petty bourgeois nonsense to want this kind of quote-unquote full democracy. That's also what Khrushchev wanted, the guy who came after Stalin. He wanted the so-called state of the whole people, which is basically full democracy. He literally said that the dictatorship of the proletariat is not necessary anymore because there's no class contradictions in the Soviet Union anymore, which is completely false. Of course there were class contradictions. I mean, many would argue, including myself, that Khrushchev himself was one of the main class contradictions. He was basically the problem. He was representing the capitalist class. And you should check out on Khrushchev's Phony Communism by Mao Zedong, where he critiques Khrushchev very convincingly and thoroughly. All these people, Kautsky, who was basically at the time he was like an ultra-opportunist Menshevik, and Khrushchev, who represented the extreme right wing of the Communist Party, and the anarchists, they are all pretty much the same on this subject. They are all horrible when it comes to understanding the dictatorship of the proletariat. Then there's a couple of more quotes. The proletarian revolution is impossible without the forcible destruction of the bourgeois state machine and the substitution for a new one. So they need a new kind of state. Nobody really understands or knows what exactly the state will look like, but we'll get into that in a moment. Then there's another quote. The victory of the dictatorship of the proletariat signifies the suppression of the bourgeoisie, the smashing of the state machine, and the substitution of proletarian democracy for bourgeois democracy. So it is supposed to be proletarian democracy, even though it says it's a dictatorship, but I've already explained that. So you should be able to understand that. And even though there were at least seemingly problems with democracy in the Soviet Union in various times, you should understand that communism doesn't mean dictatorship in the in the traditional sense of the word dictatorship. It means democracy for the workers. The democracy for the workers doesn't necessarily mean that that there's going to be direct democracy. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be parliamentary democracy. It depends. I would still say that the Soviet Union was a dictatorship of the proletariat, even though they didn't have full democracy, because it was still controlled by the Workers' Party, which represented the working class. I think it only stopped being the dictatorship of the proletariat when Khrushchev took over, when the party didn't represent the workers anymore. It started to represent the embryonic capitalist restoration, the embryonic capitalist class. But I am still willing to admit that the Soviet Union had problems with democracy, and not really because of any fault of their own. I think that they were just because, you have to also realize that the Russian Empire didn't have any kind of democracy, so the Soviet Union was still much more democratic than anything that they had before, and I would still argue that it was way more democratic than what capitalism is, but they didn't get very far in the development in that sense. In some other respects they got further. Then he talks about the Soviets. So he says the Soviet power is thus the power of the majority of the population over the minority. It is the state of the majority, the expression of its dictatorship. And if you don't know what the Soviets are they're worker councils. They're these, or not necessarily even worker councils, they're just councils. People get together and decide stuff. At the time when the Soviets there had always been Soviets in Russia, but at the time when these revolutionary Soviets came about, they were called the Soviets of the Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. So, because this was in the middle of the First World War, 1914 to 1918, so the soldiers were mainly peasants, and then there were the workers. So the peasants and workers got together and they elected people to represent them in these Soviets. And the Soviets were not legal. They didn't have any legal power. They were basically this grassroots thing that just came about and became the rivaling political structure, rivaling the Tsarist state, and then later the provisional government. And what ended up happening was that the provisional government basically lost all political power, and basically all things were eventually run by the Soviets pretty much. And then the Bolsheviks got the majority in the Soviets, and then they decided to take power, which is what happened. So he says, in that Soviet power is the most internationalist of all state organizations in class society, for by destroying every kind of national oppression and resting on the collaboration of the laboring masses of the various nationalities, it facilitates the uniting of these masses into a single state union. And he gives a couple of other reasons of why they're good. He says, in that Soviet power is by its very structure. And about the nationality thing, you have to understand that the Russian Empire was called the prison house of nations because it was a huge conglomeration of various ethnic and national groups, but pretty much only the Russians had any real cultural rights, and Stalin himself was a Georgian, so he was an oppressed nationality. So the Soviet Union also put heavy emphasis on trying to eliminate this kind of national and cultural oppression. It gave all the oppressed nationalities not only their own autonomous republics or autonomous regions, but also like full cultural rights, full political rights. But he continues, in that Soviet power is by its very structure facilitates the task of leading the oppressed and exploited masses by the vanguard of these masses by the proletariat, as the most united and most politically conscious core of the Soviets. In that Soviet power, by combining legislative and executive power in a single state organization and replacing territorial electoral constituencies by industrial units, factories and mills, thereby directly links the workers and the laboring masses in general with the apparatus of the state administration, teaches them how to govern the country. So the Soviets tried to put the workers in control as much as possible and draw them into the administration of the state machine. As he says, the Soviets were in factories and large industrial centers, and there were, of course, rural village Soviets as well, and the poor peasant committees. But the point is that they tried to draw the workers into controlling the state machine as much as possible. Of course, there were various problems, and you would need to look more deeply into that to really have a detailed analysis of what exactly happened, what was good, what was bad. But that was what they tried to do, and that's to me sounds very reasonable. In that the Soviet organization of the state alone is capable of immediately and effectively smashing and finally destroying the old, that is, bourgeois, bureaucratic and judicial apparatus. So by putting workers in control, they were able to eliminate the bourgeois apparatus, even though of course for various reasons they still needed some bourgeois managers and bourgeois experts, because the country was so poor and backward that they didn't have any. Basically all educated people were rich, so they needed to rely on some rich educated people before they could set up their own Soviet education system. So again, practical realities cause problems, but that's just something you have to deal with. And he says, in that Soviet form of state alone, by drawing the mass organization of the toilers and exploited into constant and unrestricted participation in state administration, is capable of preparing the ground for the withering away of the state, which is one of the basic elements of the future stateless communist society. And in conclusion, he says the Paris Commune was the embryo of this form. Soviet power is its development and culmination. And that is why Lenin says, the Republic of Soviets of workers, soldiers and peasants deputies is not only the form of a higher type of democratic institution, but is the only form capable of ensuring the most painless transition to socialism. Okay, and that's it for today, and if you have any questions, go ahead and ask me questions. I'll try to explain as best as I can. I would recommend you actually read the text, and I would recommend you actually check the footnotes as well. Read the things that he is quoting. I have a lot of stuff on my Marxist-Leninist theory channel, so a lot of this stuff that he quotes is there. So I will put links in the description. Okay, bye now.